100 students linked arms and faced the tanks. They were shot down. Then another 100 linked arms, and they were shot down. It is too sad to write. These brave, innocent, idealistic kids. Perhaps no incident in China's history is as infamous as the Tiananmen Square massacre of June 4, 1989. After months of protest for reform and democracy across China, the People's Liberation Army gunned down hundreds, or perhaps thousands, of innocent civilians. As hard as the Chinese government has tried to erase the memories of this event, the courageous leadership of the student protesters irrevocably changed China's political landscape and the world's view of China. The seeds of this discontent were planted long before any violence actually occurred. In 1949, Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China. In 1976, Premier Zhou Enlai died, and his followers gathered in Tiananmen Square to both honor his life and criticize the government. In what is known as the Tiananmen Incident, mourners and police clashed, and Tiananmen became a platform for the future protests that would occur there. In 1987, Party General Secretary Hu Yaobang was criticized by fellow leaders for not being harsh enough against student protests and growing liberalism, referred to as the Democracy Wall, and was eventually forced to resign. In 1989, the year of the massacre, Yaobang died, and people once again gathered into the square to commemorate him and voice their discontent. During the commemoration of his death, 3 student representatives carried a petition to the steps of the Great Hall in front of 100,000 students who had gathered in the square the night before. These protesters were angered by the lack of response from the government, and the students began to boycott their classes. Hunger strikes were initiated, and several elected student representatives began formal talks with leaders, which eventually dismantled. On the 6th day of the hunger strike, Premier Li Peng summoned several students for the televised talk in the Great Hall of the People, but the government was still preparing to declare martial law on the protesters. This plan was leaked to the student leaders, who consequently replaced the hunger strikes with massive sit-ins. On May 20th, the government formally declared martial law in Beijing, but the army's advance toward the city was blocked by both students and citizens. On the 24th, student Chai Ling was named commander-in-chief. She decided to reject the resolution and end occupation. On May 30th, the goddess of democracy was unveiled, and at 10 meters high stood a physical representation of the student-led protests. On June 3rd, Chinese troops were ordered to reclaim the square by any means necessary. At 10 p.m. that night, soldiers opened fire on any protester or civilian who tried to block the advance. Tanks and armored personnel continued to move toward the center of the city, while the men who began the hunger strikes attempted to negotiate with the troops to allow the students to leave peacefully. The government has censored the exact figures, so the number of protesters and bystanders that were killed or wounded is unknown. These protests would not have had a lasting impact on China or the world without the leadership of these students. 3 individuals in particular, Liu Xiaobo, Chai Ling, and Wang Dan, were most influential of the student leaders and changed the course of Chinese and world history. Chai Ling was born in 1966 in Shandong, China, and as a child she was a member of the Central Communist Youth League. She began to question the government and politics as she grew up when studying psychology as a graduate student at Beijing Normal University. In 1987, she participated in demonstrations to ask the government for democratic reforms. "I was afraid at first," she said, "because I know that in China the minimum jail sentence for counter-revolutionaries is 17 years. Chai had to make a decision. I knew I had 2 choices. One was to leave the country and do my graduate work in an American school. The other was to stand up and join the movement." Chai joined the sit-ins in Tiananmen Square in 1989, objecting to the government's lack of response to their demands for freedom. She and several other students were catalysts for a hunger strike, hoping to draw attention to the cause and provoke international action. On May 12th, she delivered an energizing speech that was broadcasted around the world. Chai Ling was elected commander-in-chief of the Students' Democracy Movement, and her ideas inspired thousands of Chinese students and workers to travel to the square and participate in the demonstrations. Both she and her husband feared for their lives and immediately went into hiding. I could hear bullets flying and people screaming. We climbed to the upper tier of the People's Monument, and I could see the tanks lined up at the edge of the square. They would both face immediate execution if they were discovered, as 2 of Chinese government's most wanted criminals. Most of the time I was hidden alone, and I had lots of time to reflect on what happened in Tiananmen Square. But I think that after 40 years of repression, this was the most pacific and reasonable revolt imaginable. The 2 both eventually escaped to France, and Chai later led a memorial rally in front of the U.S. Capitol, urging supporters to keep fighting for a democratic China. Chai Ling was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 and continues her activism after establishing All Girls Allowed, an organization fighting gendercide in China. Wang Dan grew up in a residential compound that belonged to the Museum of Chinese Revolution in Beijing. Under the influence of his parents, he came to know the history of the Chinese Communist Party very well. From a young age, Wang was interested in political activism. He established a Chinese chivalry party in 5th grade, and it was regarded so seriously by its members that it was reported to the Ministry of Public Security. The kids who belonged to the party were even questioned by the government officials. Because of this consistent leadership, Wang Dan was named the student representative of Peking University when the protests broke out. On campus, he had organized a democratic salon, which gave students a chance to listen to and discuss unorthodox democratic viewpoints. He was named the Chinese government's #1 most wanted criminal as one of the most outspoken and influential leaders of the movement. On July 2, 1989, Wang Dan was captured by the Chinese government and was charged with counter-revolutionary propaganda and incitement. He was kept in Xincheng prison for almost 10 years, which was packed with students who would spend their time studying and learning foreign languages. In 1998, the government made a deal to release Wang on medical parole, and since then he has become a public speaker and is teaching in Taiwan. June 4th was a turning point. Now I have clearer ideas about concepts such as socialism, communism, and totalitarianism, and I have better answers to questions and phenomena that I couldn't understand before. In 1989, it was more as if I was acting out of instinct, but I know that I will not look back. Rather, I will look forward to search for things that are important to me. Born December 28, 1955 in Changchun, Jilin, China, Liu Xiaobo received a BA in Literature from Jilin University along with an MA and PhD from Beijing Normal University. He left his position as a visiting scholar at Columbia University to participate in the 1989 democratic movement. On June 2nd, Liu went on a hunger strike in Tiananmen Square to protest martial law and appeal for peaceful negotiations between students and the government. In the early morning of June 4th, Liu, along with other leaders, attempted to persuade students to leave the square in fear of the Chinese government. Liu Xiaobo was held in Beijing's Xincheng prison until January 1991 and was found guilty of counter-revolutionary propaganda and incitement, but was exempted from punishment. In 1996, Liu was sentenced to 3 years of re-education through labor on charges of rumor-mongering and slandering and disturbing social order after drafting the anti-corruption proposals, which appealed for official reassessment of the crackdown in Tiananmen Square. Liu Xiaobo was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his lengthy and peaceful struggle over the human rights issues. For more than 20 years, he was a spokesperson for the application of human rights in China. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison and 2 years deprivation of political rights because he incited subversion of state power. Liu has consistently been maintaining that the sentence is a violation of China's own constitution and fundamental human rights.
I think it's accurate to say that, on a whole, the leaders were very hopeful and idealistic in terms of the human spirit. They just believed in the innate goodness of people, and they believed that history, the course of history in China, would lead to opening up and some of the things that they desired.
To this day, China's Communist Party is haunted by what is officially referred to as the political turmoil between spring and summer of 1989. 25 years later, the horror that unfolded on the streets of Beijing remains cloaked in the shadow of China's Orwellian policies. The domestic and international censorship of the massacre was absolute, and many young Chinese citizens have never even heard of it. Qi Xianzhong was a physics professor during the time of the protests, and believes that the students should have petitioned the government through less confrontational methods. Many people like her accept the official version saying the students were chaotic and dangerous, as it is a much more believable story than a government firing on peaceful citizens. 25 years later, she says she can never forget seeing the troops march into the square, and still gets chills when she thinks about it. Despite government efforts, the ghost of the Tiananmen tragedy will never be exorcised until the goals of the 1989 student leaders and protesters are met: transparency, fairness, and democracy in China. Without the courageous leadership of 3 student protesters, Chai Ling, Wang Dan, and Liu Xiaobo, there would not have been a permanent and lasting impact on the Chinese people and on the world. Bodies had been crushed, lives destroyed, voices silenced. They had guns, jails, and propaganda machines. We had nothing. Yet somehow it was on that June 4th that the seeds of democracy were planted in my heart, and a longing for freedom and human rights nourished. So it was not an ending after all, but another beginning.